The proper way historically to view the Bush 41 administration of 4 years and the first 2 years of Bill Clinton's presidency, basically the period between 1989 and 1994, the way to look at that 6-year period is that both administrations, both the Democrat and the Republican, were fundamentally occupied with paying back the Cold War debt that Ronald Reagan had borrowed to defeat Russia in the Cold War. In World War II, for example, the United States borrowed vast amounts of money, and its national debt soared and then came down after the war was over, and Eisenhower really worked on paying it down. But war victories typically cause vast debts, and Reagan's strategy in defeating the Soviet Union was to increase his military budget beyond what the United States could afford, going from about 3 or 4% of GDP up to 7 or 8% of GDP. And he borrowed the money, deficit spending, from Western Europe and Japan and from Americans. That was before China began lending us money. And but the equivalent was that Russia, the Soviet Union, had to increase its military spending from about 13 or 14% of its economy up to over a quarter and a third, according to the CIA estimates. And that bankrupted the Soviet Union. It caused the implosion of the Soviet Union and its destruction. And it was one of the most brilliantly conceived strategies ever. For the details on that, listen to last week's history video. But that left a gigantic deficit in the American economy and a rapidly increasing national debt. And in the late 80s, that was the main cry of economists and of politicians around the country, to get the deficit under control. Now, by nowadays, a $400 billion deficit we consider progress, for going down from $1.4 trillion, which was Obama's height. But back then, it was a very serious thing, way above the double-digit deficits that happened under Carter and Nixon and previous presidents. So Bush and Clinton both effectively sacrificed much of their administrations, and perhaps would have their presidencies, to bring that debt down. In Bush's case, of course, it was most dramatic, because he had run for election in 1988 against Mike Dukakis, parodying Clint Eastwood, saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And that became a very famous, really the signature of the Bush campaign. Read my lips, no new taxes. But in 1990 and 91, Tip O'Neill and the Democrats and his own Republican advisors persuaded him to raise taxes, violating that pledge. And the personal income tax rate went from 35%, where Reagan had left it, or 36, from the low 30s up to 35 or 36. He raised the capital gains tax, and he broke his pledge. The result was, of course, a mass infusion of revenue to the federal government, and the deficit was cut significantly, basically about a 1/3 cut in the budget deficit. But Bush paid dearly for that. First of all, the tax increase may have hurt the economy and pushed it over into recession, and he had to run for re-election with an economy that was in recession, and it violated his pledge. And he couldn't run against Clinton with the negative that Clinton had promised to, that Clinton had raised taxes in Arkansas, because he had done it in the United States. In the next video, we'll talk about Clinton's election campaign of '92, but let's just jump ahead for a minute. In '93 and '94, Clinton was under huge pressure from the Federal Reserve Board to continue to cut the budget deficit. That was back when the Fed did its job. And he told Greenspan, who was running the Fed at that point, I'll increase taxes on rich people, I'll increase taxes on all kinds of stuff. And Greenspan said, no, none of that will impress me. The only thing that impresses me is if you raise taxes on ordinary Americans, because that shows that you're committed to it. And then I, for my part, will lower interest rates and stimulate the economy. And that was the deal that Clinton and Greenspan cut. So Clinton got the Democratic Congress that he brought in with him in '92 to raise the personal tax rate up to 39.6, and to raise the capital gains rate but also to impose a 5 cent a gallon tax on gasoline, which is what Greenspan wanted, a tax that would affect everybody. That showed Greenspan that Clinton meant business in holding down the budget deficit and enabled him to cut interest rates, which kindled the enormous prosperity of the Clinton years. For his part, Clinton really did succeed in bringing down the deficit, and that, plus the initiatives of the Republican Congress that Gingrich brought in, led to several years of budget surplus. So it's correct to view the first 2 years of Clinton and the 4 years of Bush as essentially devoted to paying off the debt that Reagan incurred in winning the Cold War. It cost Bush his re-election, it cost Clinton his control of Congress in '94, and damn near cost him his re-election as president in '96. Thanks for watching.